Section 17, dual agency, customer or client, or no representation. That is the question. Dual agency requires clear thinking. Now that we have discussed implied agency, agency disclosure, compensation, and who you represent, it is time to slow down and take a closer look at one of the most misunderstood areas in Arizona real estate: dual agency, also known as limited representation. Dual agency sounds simple at first. One brokerage represents both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. But once you are actually in the middle of a deal, it can become one of the most delicate agency situations you will ever handle. Imagine this. You are the listing agent holding an open house for one of your sellers. A buyer walks in, loves the home, and says, "I want to write an offer today." That sounds exciting. But before you start writing anything, you need to stop and ask one very important question. Who do I represent? If your brokerage allows limited dual representation and both buyer and seller give informed written consent, you may be able to represent both sides in a limited capacity. But if your broker does not allow dual agency, or if either party does not consent, then you cannot simply move forward as if everyone is represented. This is where many agents get into trouble. They are excited about the sale. They want to help. They do not want to lose the buyer. But agency must be handled before the contract is written, not after the file gets reviewed by the broker. Dual agency belongs to the brokerage. In Arizona, agency flows through the designated broker. That means dual agency may exist even when two different agents are involved. For example, Mary works in the Chandler office and represents the buyer. Jim works in the Prescott office and represents the seller. They have never met. They are in different cities. They may even use different office administrators. But as both agents work under the same designated broker, the brokerage represents both parties. That creates limited dual representation. This is one of the reasons large brokerages must be especially careful with agency disclosure. The bigger the company, the more likely it becomes that one agent may sell another agent's listing within the same brokerage. Dual agency is not based on whether the agents know each other. It is based on who supervises them. Dual agency limits advocacy. One of the most important things to teach clients is that dual agency changes the role of the agent. A buyer's agent normally advocates for the buyer. A seller's agent normally advocates for the seller. But a limited dual agent cannot fully advocate for one side against the other. The agent must remain neutral on certain issues and cannot disclose confidential information without written permission. For example, if the seller asks, "How high do you think the buyer will go?" you cannot answer that question unless the buyer has given written authorization. If the buyer asks, "How low do you think the seller will take?" you cannot answer that question unless the seller has given written authorization. That is why the word limited matters. The representation is real, but it is limited. Both parties need to understand that before they agree to proceed. When the listing agent represents the seller only. Now let's return to the open house example. A buyer walks in and wants to write an offer on your listing. Your brokerage policy says you may not act as a dual agent on your own listing. In that case, you must clearly explain that you represent the seller only. The buyer may still choose to proceed without representation, but they need to understand what that means. They should complete the proper agency disclosure, acknowledging that you represent only the seller, and they should also receive the appropriate unrepresented buyer disclosure. You may be honest and fair to the buyer. You may fill out the contract based on their instructions if permitted by your broker and within the scope of Arizona law. You may explain timelines and provide factual information, but you should not advise them on price, negotiation strategy, inspection demands, or anything that would make it appear you are protecting their interests as their agent. That is a difficult line to walk. This is why many brokers prefer that unrepresented buyers obtain their own representation. Different types of agency models, agency is handled differently across the country. Some states follow a brokerage agency model, where agency belongs to the brokerage. Arizona follows this model. Some states allow office agency, where each branch office may be treated separately for agency purposes. Arizona does not currently use that model. Some states use single agency or designated agency models, where the agency relationship may be tied more closely to the individual agent. Again, Arizona does not operate that way. This is important because agents sometimes hear advice from agents in other states and assume it applies here. It may not. Arizona licensees must follow Arizona law, Arizona commissioner standards, Arizona brokerage policy, and the agency documents used in Arizona transactions. Forms used in agency relationships. Several forms may come into play when working through agency questions. The READ form explains agency relationships and allows the buyer or seller to make an informed election. The buyer-broker exclusive employment agreement establishes the buyer's employment relationship with the brokerage. The consent to limited representation is used when limited dual representation actually occurs. The disclosure of buyer agency and seller waiver and confirmation may be used in limited situations when a buyer's agent is presenting directly to a seller under specific circumstances. The important point is not simply knowing the name of each form. The important point is knowing when each form is appropriate and what conversation should happen before the form is signed. Forms do not replace explanations. Forms document explanations. The BBEEA and buyer loyalty, the buyer-broker exclusive employment agreement, has become even more important in today's real estate market. It establishes the buyer's relationship with the brokerage, explains compensation, and helps the buyer understand their obligations during the term of the agreement. If the buyer purchases a property during the agreement period, the compensation terms in the agreement matter. If the seller pays all of the agreed compensation, the buyer may not owe anything further. If the seller pays only part of it, the buyer may owe the difference. If the seller pays none of it, the buyer may be responsible for the compensation agreed to in the BBEEA. That is why this conversation must happen before showings begin. A buyer should never be surprised at closing by how their agent is paid. Be careful with narrow search terms. One practical lesson for buyer-broker agreements is to be careful about making the agreement too narrow. If a buyer says, "I only want to buy in Gilbert," an agent may be tempted to write only Gilbert into the agreement. But what happens if the buyer later purchases in Mesa, or Queen Creek, or Chandler? Overly narrow language may create problems if a commission dispute later arises. The better practice is to discuss this with your broker and draft the agreement carefully so it reflects the true scope of the relationship without accidentally limiting your protection. Every word in an agreement matters. Dual agency is not bad, but it must be managed. Dual agency is not automatically wrong. Arizona allows limited representation when properly disclosed and consented to in writing. But dual agency requires discipline. You must avoid favoring one party. You must protect confidential information. You must avoid giving advice that benefits one side at the expense of the other. You must stay within your broker's policy. And most importantly, you must make sure both parties understand the limits before they consent. Handled correctly, limited representation can work. Handled carelessly, it can create complaints, confusion, and serious risk. Before entering into limited dual representation, slow down and explain what the agent can and cannot do. Clients need to understand that dual agency limits advocacy. If either party expects full negotiation advice against the other side, limited representation may not be the right fit. Online discussion question: why does dual agency occur in Arizona when two agents from the same brokerage represent opposite sides of a transaction? Answer: because agency in Arizona flows through the designated broker. If both agents work under the same designated broker, the brokerage represents both parties, creating limited dual representation. Question: why is dual agency considered limited representation? Answer: because the broker cannot fully advocate for one party against the other and cannot disclose confidential information without proper written authorization. Question: why should agents be careful when working with an unrepresented buyer on their own listing? Because the listing agent represents the seller and must avoid giving advice that could make the buyer believe they are also being represented. Clear written disclosure is necessary to prevent confusion and implied agency.